I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Welcome back, everyone. It's the President's Guy doing another reaction today, this time from the channel The President's Explained. And this video is about presidents who were estranged from their children. And it's quite an interesting topic because, I mean, as you would imagine, when you're the most powerful person in the world, you're quite busy. So it leaves you very little time for your family. But a lot of these cases that we're going to see are going to be people who were estranged from their children even before becoming president. Lincoln himself, very close with his younger children, not so much with his oldest son, Robert. So there are a lot of reasons, and it could be, due to marital affairs. It could be just for a variety of reasons. So let's get in and see which presidents were subpar parents.
President of the United States is one of the hardest jobs in the world. You're responsible for millions of people. You make decisions that shape history, and everything you do is scrutinized by the entire country. But for all the challenges that come with leading a nation, some presidents struggled with something much more personal. They couldn't maintain a relationship with their own children. Some presidents were too consumed by work to be present as fathers. Others had conflicts with their children that never got resolved. And in one case, a president never even met his own daughter.
Or even acknowledged that she was in fact his.
In this video, we're looking at U.S. presidents who were estranged from their children. John Adams loved his country more than almost anything. He helped write the Declaration of Independence, served as the first vice president, and then became the second president of the United States. But when it came to his own family, Adams discovered that success in politics doesn't guarantee success at home. His relationship with his middle son, Charles, would become one of the most painful chapters of his life. Adams had 3 sons who survived to adulthood: John Quincy, Charles, and Thomas.
And I think it's pretty safe to say that John Quincy was probably his favorite child.
From the beginning, Adams had enormous expectations for all of them. He pushed them hard, sent them on diplomatic missions to Europe as young boys, and demanded they translate ancient Greek texts by age 10. John Quincy thrived under this pressure and eventually became president himself, but Charles and Thomas struggled. Charles Adams seemed like he had everything going for him at first. He graduated from Harvard, became a lawyer, and married into a good family. But beneath the surface, something was going wrong. Charles had always been sensitive, maybe too sensitive for the kind of relentless pressure his father put on him. While John Adams was off building a nation, Charles was spiraling into alcoholism. The drinking got worse and worse. Charles started having affairs, multiple of them, which scandalized his family in an era when such behavior could destroy reputations.
And that's true. You have to understand that the campaign for the presidency in 1800 was incredibly brutal, between Jefferson and Adams. And these kind of things are ones that today, we obviously still criticize presidents for the behavior of their children, but this would have been just a straight deal breaker to have, illegitimate children with behavioral problems, with a drinking problem, anything that seemed taboo in society, particularly in the early 19th century, late 18th century, would just destroy you. And Adams was the kind of person with ambition that he did not want to be quashed, and very likely probably would have sacrificed his kids if it could have guaranteed him getting the presidency and keeping it.
He made terrible financial decisions, at one point losing thousands of dollars that belonged to his brother John Quincy. That money was supposed to be safe, but Charles had used it for shady investments that went nowhere. John Adams watched all of this from a distance, and what he saw disgusted him. Adams was a man who believed in duty, responsibility, and moral character above all else. To him, Charles had thrown away every advantage he'd been given. In 1799, Adams made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He disowned his own son. He declared...
And you can see right there, leading up to the election of 1800, he, cuts ties with his son. And obviously, it doesn't work because he still loses. But you also have to keep in mind the difference in parenting, 200 years ago. This was the kind of, well, I've raised you the right way and I've given you everything that I want you to have. Why are you not behaving? And, it's more than likely, obviously, John Quincy did, but that his other sons just didn't want to follow in their father's footsteps. And they cracked under the pressure. And we've seen that time and time again with the children of presidents or really any successful person. It's just hard to live up to that kind of title, even before John Adams was the president.
Declared that Charles was dead to him and refused to speak to him ever again. Charles never got the chance to reconcile with his father. On November 30th, 1800, at just 30 years old, he died in New York City. The official cause wasn't cirrhosis of the liver, as many people believe, but the years of heavy drinking had destroyed his body. The news of Charles's death reached John Adams at almost the exact same moment he learned he'd lost the presidential election to Thomas Jefferson. Adams was leaving office in defeat, and his son was dead. But the tragedy didn't end with Charles. Adams's youngest son, Thomas, also became an alcoholic. Thomas would disappear for days on drinking binges and eventually moved back in with his elderly parents because he couldn't support himself. He lived to age 59, but his life was marked by failure and dependence. John Adams accomplished extraordinary things for his country, but at home, 2 of his 3 sons battled demons they couldn't defeat, and one of them died estranged from the father who had once called him the delight of my eyes. John Quincy Adams watched his brothers Charles and Thomas destroy themselves with alcohol. He saw the pain it caused his father, John Adams. You would think that experiencing that kind of family tragedy would teach him how not to raise his own children. But when it came time to be a father himself, John Quincy Adams repeated the exact same mistakes. The result was another generation of heartbreak.
And the quintessential thinking would be you wouldn't want to repeat generational trauma, but sometimes it's just baked into you. And John Quincy was a lot like his father in that respect, and he probably looked at his brothers in a lot of the same way that his father did, in a sense of disapproval. And he probably had a very similar parenting philosophy.
John Quincy Adams had one of the most impressive careers in American history. Before he even turned 30, he had served as a diplomat in multiple European countries, spoke several languages fluently, and was already being groomed for the presidency. He eventually became the 6th president of the United States, and after leaving office, he served in Congress, where he became a fierce opponent of slavery. By any measure, he was brilliant and accomplished. But as a father, he was a disaster. Adams had 3 sons who lived to adulthood: George Washington Adams.
It's sad that, it has to be quantified like that, but back in these days, it was almost a guarantee that a quarter to half of your children would not make it through adolescence.
John Adams II and Charles Francis Adams. Just like his own father had done, John Quincy pushed his sons relentlessly.
And Charles Francis Adams' son ends up working in the Lincoln administration.
He demanded perfection. He sent them away to school and expected them to excel without offering much warmth or encouragement. The pressure was suffocating. George Washington Adams, the eldest, seemed to feel that pressure more than anyone. He was named after the most famous man in American history, which was a heavy burden to carry.
Imagine so.
George graduated from Harvard and became a lawyer, but he was never happy. He drank heavily, he gambled and racked up serious debts. And at some point, he had an affair with a chambermaid and got her pregnant.
And the alcoholism, that's very often a genetic component. So, makes sense for that to be a recurring family theme.
In that era, having an illegitimate child was a scandal that could destroy a man's reputation and career. George lived in terror that his family would find out about the child. The secret ate away at him. He suffered from severe depression, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. In 1828, George boarded a steamship headed south, but he was in a terrible state of mind, reportedly acting delusional. On April 30th, 1828, somewhere on Long Island Sound, George Washington Adams jumped off the ship and drowned. He was 28 years old. His body washed up on shore a month later. Whether it was suicide or some kind of accident has been debated, but people who saw him before he disappeared said he seemed disturbed and unstable. John Quincy Adams was devastated. In his diary, he poured out his guilt, wondering if he had pushed his son too hard, demanded too much, shown too little love. But the tragedy didn't end there.
Parallels here between him and his father are astounding. Both losing a child very young, 28 and 30 respectively, and it happening during their presidencies. Now, Quincy Adams seems to have been more remorseful about his relationship with his son than his father was, but still tragic.
John Adams II, the middle son, followed a similar path. John II had been expelled from Harvard for his behavior, which was humiliating for a family that prided itself on education and achievement. When his father became president, John II served as his secretary, which was a common practice at the time. He also married Mary Helen, a young woman who had been engaged to his brother George. The whole situation caused drama and resentment within the family. John II struggled to make anything of himself. He failed as a lawyer. He failed in business. And like his uncle Charles and his brother George, he turned to alcohol. He drank heavily and died in 1834 at just 31 years old from complications related to his alcoholism. Once again, John Quincy Adams had to bury a son who had been destroyed by demons he couldn't fight and expectations he couldn't meet.
Being a father myself, I can't fathom the idea of putting so much pressure on my sons that this would happen to them. Ultimately, I want them to thrive. I want them to be successful, and I want them to be happy. But I want that to be whatever it is that they want to do, not what it is that I want them to do. And, any parent's biggest fear is losing a child. So it's just not worth putting that much pressure on them.
The only son who survived and succeeded was Charles Francis Adams, the youngest. Historians believe that John Quincy finally learned from watching his first two sons self-destruct. He softened with Charles. He gave him more freedom, less pressure, more support. Charles went on to have a successful career as a diplomat, congressman, and writer. He raised 7 children of his own and didn't repeat the mistakes of his father and grandfather. But by the time John Quincy Adams learned how to be a better father, 2 of his 3 sons were already dead. He had watched the same pattern that destroyed his own brothers play out again with his own children. He had inherited his father's demanding, critical parenting style, and it had cost him dearly. Some family curses are harder to break than others, and for the Adams family, the weight of impossible expectations crushed 2 generations before anyone figured out how to stop the cycle.
And the Adams really are kind of tragic. You consider them the original Kennedys. They are almost the original political family because, up in Massachusetts, they were, and again, the same way the Kennedys were, almost like godlike status. And especially John Adams, who plays such a quintessential and impactful role in the early years of the country, to go on and have such a mediocre presidency, a lot of that due to his own arrogance. And just to see these mistakes repeated with him, with his children, and with his son, it completely fits his personality. And John Quincy, unfortunately, was in many ways a carbon copy of his father.
Abraham Lincoln is remembered as one of America's greatest presidents.
The greatest.
He preserved the Union, ended slavery, and delivered speeches that still move people today. But when it came to his oldest son, Robert, Lincoln was distant, formal, and emotionally unavailable.
And they play this really good in the movie Lincoln. Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays Robert Todd, and you really kind of see that Lincoln is very distant with his son, because he has 4 sons. One that was around Robert's age that dies, very young, and then, of course, his son Willie dies in 1862 or 3, I believe, from typhoid, or maybe scarlet fever, one or the other. So it just leaves him with Tad, and even Tad, he dies at like 18, a couple of years after his father dies, and that leads to his mother being, put in an insane asylum. So it's just terribly ironic that the one son that made it to adulthood is the one that Lincoln was the most distant with, and that could be because who's to say that he was necessarily planned.
were never close, and the wounds from that cold relationship never healed. Robert Todd Lincoln was born in 1843 when his father was already deeply immersed in building a law career and chasing political ambitions.
Born 10 years earlier than his younger brothers, and that could have been part of the issue. And he actually goes on to be pretty successful. He ends up being Secretary of War, and he's actually present or very nearby to every presidential assassination that happens in his lifetime. Obviously, he's not far away from when his father dies. He's with Garfield when he gets shot. After that, he promises to never be around another president again, and then he's like a block away when McKinley gets assassinated.
From Robert's earliest memories, his father was almost never home. Lincoln traveled constantly across Illinois as a circuit lawyer, going from town to town for months at a time. Robert grew up seeing his father as someone who appeared occasionally, stayed briefly, and then vanished again. There was no bonding, no father-son traditions, no real relationship being built during those formative years. Then, just when Lincoln started working closer to home and could have finally been around more, Robert left for boarding school in New Hampshire. He was 16 years old. By the time Robert came back, his father was running for president. The window for building a relationship had closed.
And, his brothers had the advantage of being around their father when he was more stationary. He wasn't riding the circuit as a lawyer. And, there are tons of stories about Willie and Tad running around the White House, getting into mischief and causing problems. And after Willie dies, many people consider Tad got even worse in terms of, his kind of bratty behavior. And Lincoln was never really very disciplinarian with him because, at that point he had lost two sons. So he was just going to be as loving as he could with the one he still had.
What made the situation even more painful for Robert was seeing how differently Lincoln treated his younger brothers. Willie and Tad were clearly their father's favorites, and everyone in the family knew it. Lincoln was playful and affectionate with them. He let them run wild through the White House, bursting into cabinet meetings and causing chaos. He indulged.
And I believe they would also let livestock into the White House, and they would ride a donkey around. Actually, I think Tad had a cart that would be pulled by a donkey, and you also see this in the movie Lincoln, and would kind of run around. Mary Todd was, much closer with Robert, and obviously I believe Lincoln loved his son, but I think he was also someone of great personal ambition, and he wasn't going to let anything get in his way.
Indulged them completely, showing a warmth and patience that Robert had never experienced. Once Lincoln became president, Robert understood that any hope of closeness was gone. His father was consumed by the demands of leading a nation through its bloodiest war. Even when they were in the same building, Lincoln barely had time for brief conversations with his eldest son. Robert spent most of the presidency away at Harvard, which only widened the gap between them. Robert desperately wanted to join the Union Army and fight in the Civil War. Young men his age were dying on battlefields, and he felt ashamed sitting safely in college. But his mother, Mary, absolutely refused to let him enlist. She had already lost their son, Willie, to typhoid fever in the White House, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing another child. She begged Lincoln not to allow it. Lincoln sided with his wife, which left Robert in an impossible position. People whispered about the president's son avoiding service, while others sacrificed everything. The criticism stung. Finally, in early 1865, with the war nearly over, Lincoln arranged for Robert to join General Ulysses Grant's staff as a captain. It was a safe position, more symbolic than dangerous. Robert served for only the last few months of the war, barely seeing any real action. It was too little, too late to silence the critics or give him the sense of purpose he'd been seeking. On April 14, 1865, Mary Lincoln invited Robert to join them at Ford's Theater to see a play. Robert declined and stayed at the White House instead. Later that night, someone woke him with news that his father had been shot. Robert rushed to the Peterson house across from the theater and stayed by his father's side until Lincoln died the next morning. It was one of the few times in his life that Robert had been emotionally open with his father, and by then, his father couldn't hear him. Abraham Lincoln accomplished extraordinary things. He held the country together when it was tearing itself apart. But at home, his oldest son grew up feeling like an outsider, watching his father show warmth and love to his younger brothers while keeping Robert at a cold distance.
You've got a feel for Robert Todd Lincoln because he's trying desperately to win his father's affection, and then he's trying to kind of grapple with being the son of a president and not wanting to be a privileged person. And even when he gets into the army, he's in an incredible position of privilege, just being on Grant's staff, and I'm sure he knew that. And then spends the rest of his life living in the shadow of the greatest president of all time. So you really have to feel for him. His entire life was consumed with trying to have that relationship, not only with Lincoln, but with history that would remember him fondly. And I think he went down in history as a honorable and decent man, but he probably spent most of his life struggling with all these different things.
Warren G. Harding became the 29th President of the United States in 1921. He was well-liked, had an easy charm, and promised to bring the country back to normalcy after World War I. But behind the public image was a man with secrets, and one of those secrets was a daughter he refused to acknowledge, a daughter he would never meet, never hold, never even look at through a window. It was estrangement in its most extreme form, complete and total denial that she existed. The story began in Marion, Ohio, where Harding owned the local newspaper before entering politics. He was married to Florence Harding, a woman several years older than him who couldn't have children. Harding also had a well-known problem with fidelity. He was already carrying on a long affair with Carrie Phillips, the wife of his best friend, when he met Nan Britton. Nan Britton was a teenage girl from Marion who developed an intense fascination with Harding. She was 30 years younger than him, just a schoolgirl when she started following his career and collecting newspaper clippings about him. Her crush was so obvious that her father, a local doctor, actually spoke to Harding about it. Harding met with young Nan and told her that someday she would find the right man. But a few years later, when Nan had grown into a young woman, Harding started a relationship with her.
And I believe this is while he was governor that this began to happen.
In 1919, while Harding was still a senator, Nan became pregnant. She told him the news, and Harding promised he would take care of her. He arranged for her to stay in New Jersey, away from prying eyes. He had his lawyer handle everything, paying for a house, covering her expenses, sending regular payments of $100 to $150. On October 22, 1919, Nan gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth Ann. Harding never met her, not once. He never held his daughter, never saw her face, never acknowledged
I mean, come on. She looks just like him.
Her existence to anyone. Everything was handled through his lawyer to keep the secret buried. On August 2, 1923, Warren G. Harding died suddenly of a heart attack while traveling in San Francisco. He was 57 years old. And with his death, the money stopped. Florence Harding refused to continue any support for Nan or Elizabeth Ann. The Harding family denied everything, insisting Harding was sterile and couldn't have fathered any children. In 1927, desperate and tired of being silenced, Nan Britton wrote a book called The President's Daughter.
And also, it was a way to pay for her child, that she was now left to raise. And the book did quite well.
She detailed her relationship with Harding and their daughter.
I talk about this at length in my video on the presidential mistresses.
No legitimate publisher would touch it, so she self-published. The book sold well, but the backlash was brutal. Newspapers called her a liar and worse. She was vilified as someone trying to profit from a dead president's name. For decades, most people dismissed her story. Historians didn't believe her. The Harding family continued denying everything. Nan Britton died in 1991, still insisting Harding was Elizabeth Ann's father. Her daughter died in 2005, having lived her entire life under a cloud of doubt about who her father really was. The truth finally emerged in 2015 through DNA testing. Harding had indeed fathered Elizabeth Ann, just as Nan Britton had claimed. But by then, Nan had been dead for 24 years and Elizabeth Ann for 10. They had both died without ever seeing the world acknowledge the truth.
unbelievably tragic.
Franklin D. Roosevelt led America.
I would venture to guess that's probably the most disgusting one we'll see on this list. And there's no doubt that Harding knew about it. And just unashamedly irresponsible and cold-blooded.
Through the Great Depression and World War II, serving an unprecedented 4 terms as president. His leadership during those crises made him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. But while Roosevelt was focused on saving the nation, his 5 children were growing up largely without him. The relationship between Roosevelt and his children was distant and strained, and that strain showed up throughout their lives. Roosevelt had 6 children, though 1 died in infancy. The 5 who survived were Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. From the beginning, Roosevelt approached fatherhood differently than he approached the presidency. He was charming and affectionate in short bursts, but the day-to-day work of raising children was left to others. He enjoyed playing with them when they were small, but as they grew older, his political career consumed more and more of his time and attention. The demands on Roosevelt were extraordinary. His paralysis from polio in 1921 required immense effort just to maintain the appearance of mobility. His political career took him from New York State politics to the governorship to the presidency during 2 of the most turbulent periods in American history. There simply wasn't much time or energy left for his children. The children were raised mostly by nannies and staff, seeing their father at meals or official functions, but rarely getting sustained attention from him. Anna, the only daughter, had perhaps the most complicated relationship with her father. She moved into the White House twice as an adult, first during a divorce in the early 1930s, and again in 1944 when Roosevelt asked her to serve as his assistant and hostess. His health.
And she's actually with her father when he dies, and I believe she's with him. And she was quite aware of his extramarital affairs, and I believe was actually helping him kind of keep it from her mother. And that's an odd position to put your child in, to say the least.
Health was declining rapidly by then, and Anna took on significant responsibilities managing his schedule and care. But Roosevelt put Anna in an impossible position during those final years. He had rekindled a relationship with Lucy Mercer, a woman he had been involved with decades earlier, and he asked Anna to help arrange secret meetings between them. Anna went along with it, keeping...
I mean, you're having your child help you cheat on your wife. I mean, those jokes just write themselves.
The meetings hidden and helping coordinate the logistics. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Lucy Mercer was with him at Warm Springs, Georgia. Anna had to be the one to tell the rest of the family what had been going on. She spent the rest of her life
I mean, how do you have that conversation with your mother? Hey, Mom, Dad's dead, and he was with his mistress, and I knew about it the whole time, and it was helping him.
Conflicted about what her father had asked her to do and the position he had put her in. The sons had their own struggles with their father's legacy. Some tried to follow in his footsteps politically. Franklin Jr. and James both served in Congress, though neither achieved the kind of success their father had. Elliot went in a different direction entirely. In 1973, nearly 3 decades after Roosevelt's death, Elliot published a book called An Untold Story, The Roosevelts of Hyde Park. The book revealed that Roosevelt had been involved with Lucy Mercer until the day he died, described other romantic relationships Roosevelt had pursued, and painted a picture of their parents' marriage as cold and loveless. Elliot claimed he was setting the record straight,
and when his brother's going to Congress, one of them ends up becoming a Republican, I believe, and is actually quite confrontational with Harry Truman during his presidency.
Telling the truth about who his father really was, but his siblings saw it as a betrayal. They publicly condemned the book and accused Elliot of profiting off their father's memory by airing private family matters. The rift between Elliot and his siblings lasted for years, and some of them never fully forgave him for writing it. John, the youngest son, took a different path from his father politically. In 1952, he left the Democratic Party and became a Republican, supporting Dwight Eisenhower for president. It was a public break from everything his father had stood for. The Roosevelt children collectively had 19
Which you have to imagine there's a little bit of spite that was baked into that decision.
marriages among the 5 of them. Several struggled with alcoholism. Their personal lives were often chaotic and frequently made headlines, which Roosevelt found difficult. He once remarked to an aide that being the child of a president was a terrible burden. He understood the weight they carried, but understanding it and knowing how to help them carry it were different things. Roosevelt gave his children access to wealth, privilege, and opportunity. What he couldn't give them was consistent presence or sustained attention.
Which is probably the most important thing a child needs.
The presidency demanded too much, and his own health struggles demanded the rest. His children grew up with a father who was larger than life to the rest of the world, but often felt distant and unavailable to them. The complicated feelings they had about their father showed up in their choices, their marriages, their careers, and in some cases, the stories they chose to tell after he was gone.
And just imagine that the average person gets more time with your father on the radio than you get with him in person. Imagine what that does to a child. Very interesting video, and definitely takes me aback, particularly as a parent. You know, I could never imagine, no matter how successful I ever got in any endeavor in this life, neglecting them for a single second. They come first before anything and everything. But let me know what you thought of that video. Are there any other deadbeat, father presidents that were left out? Who are some of your favorite and least favorite presidents? Let me know down in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and share the video if you enjoyed it. And until next time, never stop learning.